to the Santa Barbara Water Commission's Thursday, November 17th meeting. Like to have call to order.
Chair Young,
Here.
Vice Chair Cooney,
Here.
Commissioner Kameyer,
Here.
Commissioner Keller,
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Council Liaison Sneddon.
Not here as yet. Mr. Hagmark, do we have any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair, there are no changes to the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Now's the time for public comment. If there's any member of the public who would wish to address the commission on any item that is not on the agenda and within our purview, now is the time to come forward. Madam Clerk, do we have anyone on Zoom that is wishing to speak to us?
No, there's no public comment at this time.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to item 5, consent items, the meeting minutes. Mr. Hagmark, would you like to introduce this item?
I don't have anything specific there, just looking for any comments on that item.
I move approval of consent calendar. I have just a question clarification. So the increase on this one is just the 247,000, and it's just for the changing the end date from March to December of 2024, correct? Because it has, the current contract amount has a change order of 1.5 million, but that's something that was done in the past, right? Correct?
That's correct. This is the third amendment to this contract, and this is an on-call contract, so as needed. Typically, we've been using them to help with our invoicing and review of some of the water quality submittals.
Okay, so I think we should break these two down because I can't vote on the meeting minutes. I wasn't here. I think I need to abstain from that. But I can,
Yeah, you can actually vote on it and just let the record show that you abstain on item B.
on
That's the
item
second-
A.
on the- Yeah,
On item A,
on item A.
right. Okay. All right.
So I do have, I did make the motion to approve the
Okay.
consent.
We need a second for that?
Commissioner Davis,
Yes.
Commissioner Keller,
Yes?
Commissioner Kameyer,
Yes.
Vice Chair Cooney,
Yes.
and Chair Young.
Yes, and I abstain, though, from sub-item A, meeting minutes. Okay, let's move on to administrative items. 6A, water and wastewater fiscal year 2023-2025 capital programs. Mr. Hagmark?
Yes. Mr. Chair, Commissioners, every year, or every other year, I should say, we bring to the commission our capital improvement program, looking for a recommendation. This is a long process that we go through that ultimately does go to the Planning Commission, Finance Committee, and then eventually on to Council for approval. We do look at 5 years, but what we're taking action on is what we're going to be doing in the next 2 years. So it's one of those things that we continue to refine. And so with that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Ms. Cook, our Water Resources Financial Officer, who's going to walk through that.
All right. Hello, Chair Young and Commissioners. As Joshua said, I'm Gabrielle Cook, the Water Resources Financial Officer. So I will give an overview of the CIP, or the Capital Improvement Project plans. And we do have engineering staff here to answer any specific questions that you may have.
Could you speak up a little louder? That'd be great.
I will try. Yes. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Oops. Okay, so this is the capital improvement plan, and as Joshua was just saying, it does forecast the water and wastewater needs over the next 5 years. We will focus on the first 2 years, as that will be incorporated into our next budget cycle that will ultimately be approved by council. This is our opportunity to prioritize projects and identify funding, unmet needs, and grant funding and loans. So we incorporated the planned capital improvements that were identified in the El Estero Facility Plan, as well as the Water Distribution Infrastructure Plan. And both of these plans were completed relatively recently, and they had a 30-year outlook. So by including these planning elements, it makes for a more stable approach to the maintenance of the infrastructure. here's an overview of the CIP adoption schedule. And as you can see, we have been working on this for the past couple of months. And right now, it is ready for public boards and commission review and input. And it will ultimately be presented at Planning Commission, Finance Committee, and then at Council. I wanted to note that there is baseline capital flowing throughout the CIP, and the baseline capital addresses the smaller capital needs that keep the system running. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, discussing that today, but if you do have questions, we are happy to answer them. Okay, we'll move ahead to the wastewater CIP. This is an overview of all of our wastewater projects that we have planned in the next couple of years. So it is 8 of those, and I will go into more detail on each of those in the further slides. Ooh, that is kind of small. Okay.
It works. We have it in the back.
Okay, good. So this is the proposed budget for the 5-year CIP. And you can see that it has the 5 years, and then there's this additional column called future needs. And in that column, we either put fiscal year 29 or any projects that we know we need to do, but we haven't figured out what fiscal year that they're going to take place. Okay. And I wanted to, again, bring your attention to the first 2 years, as those are the years that we will discuss in detail. We have 2 SRF-funded projects that will start within the next couple years. The first of those is the Braemar Lift Station Rehabilitation Project. And the Braemar Lift Station is the largest wastewater lift station in the collection system, with a pumping capacity of 1,000 gallons per minute. The purpose of this project is to make major upgrades to the mechanical and electrical equipment, and also to harden the facility against flooding. So the project is at 100% design, and we expect to execute an SRF loan agreement within the next month or so. And then following that timeline, we would go out to bid for construction by January. And then we expect construction to take a couple years.
Could you just clarify on the SRF loan? Is that something you've already applied for, or how does that process work?
Yes, so we already applied for the SRF loan, and we're just in the final agreement level, I guess, phase of it, because it takes approximately 12 to 18 months to go through the whole application process. And so this was started a couple years ago. This one has taken a lot of time.
And then a follow-up, which might be an ignorant question because I don't know much about SRF loans, but are the increasing interest rates that we're seeing in the broader economy, do those affect these kinds of loans?
They're generally very low interest rates. We haven't received the final interest rate, but when I talked to the state, it was about 1.6%. If we had gotten it locked in December of last year, it would have been less than 1%.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the second.
Sorry, quick question, and maybe more for the technical side. So it says it's addressing already sea level rise considerations. What's being done in that respect? Are we lifting in some places, or?
Yes, Chair Young, Commissioner Member Keller, Phil Maldonado, Interim Principal Engineer for our Water Resources Engineering Division Group, and lead on the Braemar project. Yes, we actually modeled both the FEMA flood zone and had to remap the FEMA maps, and we did include sea level rise into that modeling. And it actually had very minimal impact for this facility, given its location just north of Cliff Drive. And so the FEMA maps, the flood zone maps, stayed the way that they were updated, which keeps the facility itself just out of the floodway, right? And and therefore we merely had to flood-proof. We did not have to raise the facility any more than it already is. If you could take a look right there, this is the driveway as you come into the facility. You can see that the facility itself is already raised approximately 3 feet above the ground level there.
Thank you.
But there's a deep chamber. I mean, the part that's lifted is just that, right? I mean, there's a gigantic vault.
A wet well, yes, and that is where the collected wastewater from the system collects into that wet well and then is pumped up Cliff Drive. That is a sealed wet well, and yes, it is below ground, but the critical equipment, the electrical equipment, and all of the controls equipment is in that house that you see in the photograph there.
How close is the flood line to the facility, the flood line due to sea level rise?
The floodway, yes, and it is still within the flood zone, so that's why we do need to do additional flood proofing to the walls of the exterior walls of the facility. But we are right adjacent to Rowborough Creek, and the projected floods would be just a few feet, basically, away from the building, but they are anticipated to go down the roadway, not necessarily through the building.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? No. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the electrical distribution renewal project. And the purpose of this project is to replace the 50-year-old existing electrical distribution system, including the main electrical panel and all 5 substations. The system will be sized to meet future electrical demands, maximize use of renewable energy, and designed to provide redundancy and improve overall reliability. This project is also at 100% design, and we are expecting to execute that loan agreement in the next couple months and go out to bid for construction in February. And then this project will take, we anticipate, several years.
When both of these projects, when they are, once we receive bids, we will come back through the Water Commission for an update on the final cost, or at least the proposed cost for that.
Okay, I'm going to move through the next few programs fairly quickly. The El Estero maintenance program is for ongoing equipment rehabilitation or replacement in order to keep El Estero operating at a fully functional level. This includes maintaining compliance with the city's federal national pollutant discharge elimination system permit. You'll notice that the budget increases in fiscal year 25, and that's because we're planning for the design of the air thickener control building for solid processing.
So a question for you. With each of these projects, are we planning for putting solar panels on roofs that are suitable for that? Is that in the mix?
It is not in the CIP. No, we need to get the electrical project done first, and that's anticipated, I think, at this point about 3 years. It's a pretty long. It's going to be 18 months to probably get equipment on site. Just some of the procurement is really long lead time items. Once that project is done, or at least underway, then we'll start planning out where strategically we did look at this. I don't know, 10 years ago, we looked at what parts of the facility would be suitable for solar. There isn't a lot, but we certainly, one of them being the solids handling building. I don't know if you recall that. It's in the hourglass looking shape. It's up in the top corner there. That roof was noted as being potentially a site, but we need to do some structural upgrades to that building before we can put solar on it. So we will then kick off a project to do kind of those initiatives on site, but we wanted to get the electrical project done first, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, next we have the strategic plan implementation program, and that includes funding for studies on alternative process options, updates to previous master plan studies, and other studies that support development of the wastewater CIP. The lift station maintenance program is meant to prevent lift station failures and collection system overflows by timely replacement of motor control centers, pumps, and so forth. In fiscal year '24, we are planning on the design of Via Lucero Force Main, and then you'll see that there's a pretty significant jump in fiscal year '25, and that is because we are funding the construction of the Via Lucero Force Main in that year. The Sanitary Sewer Capacity Improvement Program is comprised of projects that will help relieve capacity constraints during wet weather and prevent sewage spills. It will also bring the collection system up to date to meet increasing wastewater flows as a result of development. In fiscal year '24, it includes the final design of the Santa Barbara Junior High project. And then again, there is a large jump in funding for fiscal year '25, and that includes the construction of the Santa Barbara Junior High project.
I had a question about the capacity constraints during wet weather. In our last meeting, we talked a little bit about this challenge of basically stormwater getting into sanitary sewers during wet weather. Is this in part addressing that, or is this a separate thing?
No, this will address the known situations that we have. And then you may recall, we're also going to be conducting an I&I studies to update it. It's been a while since we've done one, and hopefully it will rain, because in order to do the I&I, we need to actually see some rain. And then that will help us, again, I think, refine where this program continues to go, where are weak spots in the system, and where have we made some successes, because we have been, you know, finding these illegal connections and shutting them down. And so how is the system, we're hoping to hear, I think we had a system that could handle 15-year rain events, and we're hoping to move the needle on that. So that's kind of our goal, is, again, continue to kind of tighten up the system so that we don't have as significant I&I getting in.
Thank you.
Okay, the Sanitary Sewer Overflow Compliance Program is comprised of projects that will help sewage spills, prevent sewage spills. This level of funding primarily supports structural rehabilitation of approximately 1% of the public sewage collection system mains and manholes. And then finally, we have the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Program. And this funds ongoing planning efforts that are needed to adapt the wastewater system to the impacts of sea level rise. The program will assist with the feasibility study and implement the chosen actions resulting from that study. Relocation and or flood proofing of the sewer trunk main and associated sewer collection infrastructure that's currently located south of Cabrillo is a high priority project.
So we established this program. Funding you see here is primarily planning money. We did our Sustainability Resiliency Department landed a roughly $2 million grant. So we're going to be using this kind of as our matching funds for water, both water and wastewater contributing, along with waterfront. And who else is involved? I think Parks may have some involvement in that as well. So this is really just planning money right now. Out of that study, there will come actions and, of course, action levels for when we need to do things. So that's when the real costs will start to come into play.
Okay, I'm going to bring you back to this budget overview slide. And here I have the two SRF-funded projects highlighted, as they are the two major projects that we're going to be focusing on the next couple of years. And then here I highlighted the total budget for the capital improvements, including the future needs. And I'm happy to answer any questions for wastewater.
I had, it's a couple of questions on the budget. So one, okay, so it's good to see. So these are the two that are SRF funded. It would be helpful if we had like the funding sources on each line item so that it was a little bit clearer. But so it's predominantly SRF funded, and then when this wastewater source of funds is, where is that coming from? Is that like existing wastewater capital improvement money?
Yeah, that would be the rates, basically. So we call that pay-go or pay with cash. Basically, we're paying as we go.
Got it. And I was just curious around the SRF loan. So does that money have to go towards implementation, or is that available for kind of planning or feasibility studies as well?
I kind of drawn the line that if the project doesn't cost, I think it's now even probably well over $1 million, it's probably not worth getting an SRF because we spend a substantial amount of time going through that process and getting it. So there's kind of a threshold of return on doing those. However, when we get these, we are able to roll in the design costs. So we're right now fronting the design for both of these projects. Once we get that's one of the first things we'll do is submit the design costs and get reimbursed.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
just a quick question, related to both wastewater and water. As I recall, in our fee structure and looking at the fee projections and the structure that we adopted, we were looking at a 3 to 5 year capital improvement program that we incorporated into the assessment of fees. Do you recall?
When we do our rate setting, we actually look out 10 years.
Oh, it's 10 years. Okay.
Yeah, and we do, all of this is coming out of our infrastructure master plan, so it's kind of fed into there to help us with that long-range planning. But you're right, the 3 to 5 years is kind of what's defining that, the rates that we're adopting, because we're typically looking at the rates we're adopting it for 3 years, but we're also making sure we're on target with that 10-year model.
Yeah, that's what I call, thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's really commendable in terms of the financial planning that, out of, for example, $80 million for wastewater, almost everything is funded except for $5 million. And, the planning that has been gone, that, we have the funds to be able to cover these projects. Same with the water side, there's future needs, which that's long-term, but otherwise it's, we almost have everything covered. So I think that's really good planning. And just a quick comment, Cora. Each project indicates at the bottom what's the funding source, so they have it there.
Thank you. I was just going to, I just saw that, so thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
from the commission? No? Okay.
Okay, we're going to move on to the water CIP. And I'm going to go kind of through the same structure as we did for wastewater. So here are the 11 programs that we have planned for the capital improvements, and I will go in detail on each slide coming up. Okay. Again, this is the overview of the water CIP. You have the 5 years, and then you have the future needs. But I do just want to bring your attention to the 2 fiscal years, 24 and 25, as that is what will be incorporated in our 2-year budget coming up. Okay. The Cater Reservoir Resiliency Project will add a second finished water reservoir next to the current clear well and provide seismic upgrades to the existing reservoir. The project is currently at 60% design, and we are in the process of submitting an SRF loan application. We just did that a couple weeks ago. And as we talked about before, the process is quite long. So we anticipate it to take a year to a year and a half or longer before we get a fully executed agreement.
And just a reminder, our JPA partners will be picking up approximately 40% of these costs.
The Cater Treatment Plant Maintenance Program addresses baseline capital improvements such as filter and media replacement, equipment upgrades, and process improvements. You'll notice that there is a little jump in funding for fiscal year 25, and that's because we have funding for the Cater Master Plan for that year. The desalination program includes $600,000 annually for capital maintenance. And then there is quite a large spike in fiscal year 25, and that's because we're including the construction for the hardening of the desal pump platform, as well as construction of the desal administration building. The pump platform, we do have a FEMA grant for that, so we are only paying for 25% of that. And that 25% is actually broken down even further because of our water supply agreement with Montecito. They will be paying about 45%.
Sorry, quick technical question. what's the purpose of that hardening, and why, is that going to be giving us more resilience in terms of sea level rise or other factors?
So I'll speak to that. So our offshore intakes, we have 2 offshore intakes, and when they were installed, the design was supposed to have rock riprap around the structures. For whatever reason, that rock riprap was never installed. And in 2017, 2018, we had a pretty good storm surge, and it removed, under one of them, it removed quite a bit of the sand underneath it. And so the only things holding it in place were the piles, and that wasn't really designed to be suspended above the ocean floor. And so this project, we were able to get FEMA funding for, and so we're going to be going in to basically install the rock riprap that should have gone in, and that will keep the sediment underneath the structure and keep it grounded. Yeah.
So was FEMA okay, or interested or okay with it specifically because it was storm surge damaged?
Yes.
Rad, I guess.
Okay, the groundwater program addresses maintenance and improvements for the city's groundwater system. In 25, it does increase, the funding does increase a little bit, and that's because we've included well rehabilitation in that year, along with the regular maintenance and development. The pump station program provides regular maintenance of the distribution pumps, and this includes replacing electrical, mechanical, and control components of the pump. The recycled water program funds ongoing renewal and replacement of the recycled water treatment plant and distribution center. The reservoir program addresses the capital improvements for the water distribution potable storage reservoirs as well as the Gibraltar Reservoir. And in fiscal year 24 and 25, the bulk of it is going to be in fiscal year 25. We're going to be completing repairs, major repairs to the Gibraltar caretaker residence. The Sea Level Rise Adaptation Program supports the ongoing planning efforts that are needed to adapt the water system to the impacts of sea level rise. The study will identify triggers for mid and long-term adaptation of the water system, including the desal plant, Storage Unit 1 groundwater wells, the Ortega groundwater treatment plant, and distribution piping located in low-lying areas. The Vic Trace Reservoir was originally constructed in 1952, and through careful assessment and analysis, the reservoir has been prioritized for complete replacement. The design of this project is slated to begin in fiscal year 24, and then we're anticipated to begin construction in fiscal year 26. I know the slide says 27, but that's a typo, so it will be in 26 that we start construction. And we are pursuing a SRF loan for this project as well, as it is substantial. The water mains are the city's largest asset, approximately 300 miles of water main. And the funding in this program supports the City Council's goal of replacing 2% of the main annually. You'll notice that the funding in 25 actually goes down. And that's because in 24, we're including a couple special projects, including the La Vista Zone Transmission Main downsize, as well as the highway crossing projects.
Question about the 300 miles. At some point, do we reach the goal of having replaced everything that needs to be replaced, and we can back off for a few years because we've kind of caught up? Or is this targeted that we are continually replacing indefinitely?
You know, that is a fantastic question, and we've talked. We used to have a goal of 1%, and what we started that goal. I believe Bob Roebuck started that goal sometime in the 90s with City Council, got that initiated, and that program initially was making a difference, and then we just kept the breaks history just kept going up. We did a further analysis and felt like what we were experiencing was a large portion of our pipes were put in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and those pipes were reaching the end of their useful life. And what we needed to do to get ahead of it was to increase the main program. So we anticipate needing to sustain about a 2% for about 20 years, and then we'll be able to drop down to a new normal after that. But yeah, since the pipes weren't put in equally over time, and they don't all have the same type of lifespan, it's kind of made this kind of balloon payment that, so we've had to have a more aggressive replacement program right now.
So where are we in that 20-year period?
We just started it. Yeah, that,
Year one.
2018 council in there approved the move to 2%. And then, of course, during the pandemic, we kind of pulled back from that because people were stuck in their houses and we didn't want to turn the water off. So we're in the first part of that, 20 years, yeah.
So I'm sure you've thought of this, but it's just my curiosity. Does it make sense to go to 3%? I mean, is there any monetary savings going on?
We looked at that. No, it was great because it came back and the ideal was to pursue 2.7, and we felt like financially that was a little more aggressive than we thought the community could handle and we could handle. That's a lot of pipe to replace at once, and it's a lot of tearing up of city streets. And so we kind of struck this sweet spot, we hope, with 2%, that we can be very surgical with what we're replacing, and that will be successful too. But we're going to continue to analyze, and if we need to pivot and do more, we'll certainly bring back the discussion to you all.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a question out of curiosity. As you're replacing the water mains, are the new pipes, now that it's been, 50 years or, 60 years, do they have longer lifespans now? Like, has the technology improved, or is it still like another, 50 to 70-year lifespan?
Good question. We think so. We think they do. A lot of the new pipes we're using are either plastic, and we are going to the higher pressure class of pipe to make sure that they can withstand a longer life and take more pressure cycles. And then the metallic pipe that we're using is concrete lined, so it reduces the formation of corrosion inside. And then we're sleeving, I don't know if you can see in that one, we sleeve the outside with plastic so that there's no dirt sitting against the metallic pipe. So we have implemented a lot of techniques that I think will make a big difference, but time will kind of tell the story on there. I always caution that we're still using valves, and that valve technology, although we do have it coated, powder coated and stuff, those valves only have a certain life and they start to build up corrosion on them, and then eventually they don't work. So you may have to do a project where you go in and replace all the valves or something of that nature. So hopefully it'll all wear out at the same time, but that's...
And then we just replace everything.
Then we replace it all, yeah. Yeah, and I do want to note, we are not doing services. So the city is fortunate. We do not have lead services, but we have copper throughout. And we keep an eye on it, but we're finding that our copper, for the most part, is in good shape. There are some areas of the city where the soils are more reactive, and we do get pinholes in the copper services. But in general, when we do main replacements, we're just reattaching the existing copper services that are there.
Good to know. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, the water meter program includes ongoing advanced metering infrastructure contracts, as well as ongoing replacement of meter-related infrastructure needs. Back to the budget overview. Again, I highlighted the SRF-funded projects, as those are, again, some major projects that we're going to be focusing on in the next couple of years. And then we've highlighted the total of the CIP for the 5 years plus the future needs. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can regarding the water CIP.
at some point, I feel like there's could be a degree in naming projects. We continue to challenge ourselves with coming up with names that would be attractive to grants and SRF. So if you know someone who's really good at naming projects, just send it my way. We have some good discussions internally. What would be the best way to sell the project? So.
What is the column future needs?
So the future needs is either going to be fiscal year '29, or it's going to be for projects that we know that we're going to do, but we just don't know what year we're going to do them.
So I'll give you some examples. Under desal program, you'll notice we have 50 million in there. That is a placeholder for an expansion of production. No idea when we're pulling that trigger, but just starting to, and that's something we're going to be, I think I mentioned last time, we're going to be investigating what that cost might be in today's dollars. We do have some older numbers on that, but that's something that we anticipate being out there, and this drought could drive that decision sooner, or it could remain out there as a future cost. What's another one that we have in there? The media for Cater treatment maintenance, the media filters. We continue to, I think the media that's in there, gosh, it must be like 15 years old. We continue to do sieve analysis of that. The media seems to be holding up, but at some point, after you backflush it enough, the particles start to break down and it no longer is effective, and we need to replace that media. And we have that as a, it's roughly a $3 million cost, and we just keep pushing it out, but it's a future cost that we recognize at some point we're not going to no longer be able to do that. So it's just examples.
Any questions?
If I could, go ahead. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is move up the AMI schedule because I really miss my reading. I really got addicted to that, and so again, we could do that. Really, I'm really glad to see that moving ahead. My question has to do with, I should have asked it under the Vic Trace. When we're looking at the reservoir replacement, is Sustainability Department looking at the potential for solar on those things and incorporating that into the planning and design?
Absolutely. That we'll be approaching this as a one water project, looking for this to be a win on multiple levels. How can we help harden this community against the threats of climate change? How can we address the water storage needs that we have, water quality issues? How can we leverage our renewable portfolio? So, and I think we're going to try and check as many boxes on that. This should be a very attractive project to grant funding, but it is going to be significant. And I think the challenges for us is going to be how do we prepare that community for that? I don't know that it's all going to happen at one time, but how do we prepare them for what has been this, quiet backyard for most of these folks? How do we prepare them that the site really has, I know you may not be down at sea level, but this site has a lot of potential to help the city prepare for the future.
It gave me an opportunity also to compliment you. Our trucks out in the field all have one water on them now, and I've had lots of comments from my friends and people in the public. What is that and what that is? It's really been a good way to basically get that message out, so I do want to compliment you on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to hear that.
Arturo?
I just wanted to, my comment was going to be seconding the point of that Vic Trace Reservoirs really is a great opportunity to think about solar, or mostly for solar as a renewal. I think that's something that should be considered.
Councilmember Sneddon?
Thank you. I just want to comment that it's such an incredible portfolio of assets and maintenance and work and how much goes into, not just turning on the tap and the water that comes out, but then flushing the toilet, and where does that all go? And I just really want to highlight how you're doing this all with, ratepayer money carefully managed and looking at the short term and the long term for these really expensive technical programs, but really particularly with sea level rise. And Dave Davis and I are on that sea level rise adaptation planning committee, and just how much thought goes into, well, what are we going to do about the long range planning? And I think this is the first time I'm seeing it worked into a budget in a realistic way to actually be planning for it with eyes wide open, and I just really, really commend that and appreciate this budget.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, just to second Councilmember Sneddon's commendations, this is great to see, so thank you for putting it all together. I had 2 questions, and then one just flag on this copy. There's the 3.5 million in grants that's missing on this version. And, sorry. Yeah. And then I was just wondering, so are all of the projects that are debt financed in the CIP, is that kind of how it's structured, or are there debt finance projects that are not, that fall outside of the CIP?
The only thing that we are currently doing debt financing for is capital projects. Yeah. In the past, there had been some bonds that were floated, and I don't know exactly what all those bonds went to. It's way before I started in this position. So, but going forward, we have no plans to do any other type of debt financing except for capital improvements like this. And they make a lot of sense. I mean, as you start to get more into how we do our rate setting, it's in the government realm, it's really difficult to build up a war chest of money and then do a project. It's complicated, and the SRF provides a really great opportunity to do that with very low interest rates that really reflect almost using cash in that sense. There are some projects that kind of fall in that like $5 million range that we try to cash fund, but as they start to kind of get over that, it really makes more sense to put it to debt service.
Got it, thank you. And then my last question was just thinking about the prospect of direct potable reuse, and I know that's being explored, and we had that assessment recently brought to the commission and talked about how it's it looked like it's maybe slightly more cost-effective than desal, or at least comparable. And I was just wondering, I guess, at some point, does that start getting considered in this long-range planning?
Yeah, I think we'll start to pull that in as the regulations start to firm up on that. One of the guest speakers I'm trying to get to come speak to the commission is from the state, speaking kind of on the status of that whole thing coming together. I still think it's somewhere in the 2035, 2034 range is when I think it'll be a viable option for us, just knowing kind of the hurdles that need to be overcome, and I think we want to see some of the larger agencies go through those. But that doesn't mean we can't start the conversation, and we can't start kind of thinking strategically how we would tackle that. So I think it will eventually make it into our capital planning as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so we have a recommendation in front of us.
Yes.
And how does this work? As I look at this, we're just recommending that the Planning Commission receive this report. They don't have to receive it, but we're recommending that they receive it and consider it?
Yeah, so the city council has established this process in which the various boards and commissions will take up the capital program and put kind of a stamp that we support this on there, so that as it works its way through, if there are any issues, Water Commission had a concern about there not being something here, or there was something in here you didn't agree, that would make it into and ultimately make its way up through the review boards into the council for additional consideration, because that obviously council has ultimate authority and can make changes at the end of the day.
But this suggests that the Planning Commission could decide they're not going to review and consider the recommendation? It's just a wording thing. I'm
Yeah,
curious about.
that's true. This was kind of the general wording that was given, but happy
right.
to amend if you feel like there was better language.
No, I'm good. Okay.
Insist,
All right.
strongly insist.
So do we have a motion?
I motion staff recommendation.
Okay.
Second.
And a second. Go ahead, Madam Clerk.
Commissioner Davis?
Yes.
Commissioner Keller?
Yes.
Commissioner Kammeyer,
Yes.
Vice Chair Cooney,
Yes.
and Chair Young.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for that report. All right, let's see. Next item is 6B, the proposed reserve policy changes. Mr. Hagmark.
Yes, Chair Young, Commissioners, this is a unique opportunity. For a while, we've been the city has kind of a hodgepodge of reserves. Not to say we're loose about it, but there are things that have been growing over the years. Oh, you need to save money for this, or you need to do money for that. And as a whole, we've been working with our finance director to kind of codify all this so that it's written down exactly what these reserves are for and pulling it all together. So this is ultimately going to City Council in December for the whole city. But specifically, there's some unique things about running a utility that we have recommended some changes and are part of the proposal. And some of the things I just want to highlight as we'll get into the conversation on this is we have very unique rates in Santa Barbara. And primarily that's driven by the unique costs that we have for water, desal, state water, those things. And it has led to a very inclined rate structure that I think this commission and council are very proud of. It maintains very affordable water if you're a low water user. And if you're a high user, we got your water, but it comes at the real cost of providing that service. But what it does recognize is a vulnerability as well, right? If you do get extreme conservation, we could quickly find yourself unable to pay the bills. And so a lot of our reserves, as we kind of get in this, we'll talk about how those fit in together. Not only that, but we live over several faults. We just generally live in a very vulnerable area. And so with that, that's kind of the tact we've taken with these reserves. And we'll get into it a little bit, the pros and cons of reserves. Why not have more reserves? And there are drawbacks to that as well. And so with our presentation today, hopefully it'll kind of give you a good sense of how we've approached the reserves and what we're recommending for City Council to take action on.
Good morning again. You're stuck with me. I'm Gabrielle Cook, the Water Resources Financial Officer. So as Joshua mentioned, this presentation is just going to be an overview of the proposed changes to the reserve resolution for water and wastewater. And finance is going to take the entire resolution of the proposed changes to council on December 6th. I'm going to go over a little bit of the background, our existing reserves, the industry standards and minimum reserves, the proposed changes, and then finally our recommendation. So reserves are set aside for specific cash flow requirements, and these can include capital projects, unexpected financial events such as recessions, financial impacts from natural disasters such as floods or droughts or wildfires. And the challenge in establishing reserves is striking a healthy balance that reflects that level of risk that we might reasonably anticipate. So some of the benefits of having a healthy reserve are that the level of reserves maintained by utility, they're an important component in debt rating, which consequently affects long-term debt interest rates for future issuances. And Water Resources was just recently rated by Standard & Poor's, and our rating increased from a AA negative to a AA, and that is largely in part due to our reserve levels. Another benefit is that reserves can absorb capital costs related to catastrophic failure of a critical infrastructure component, and they can also cover annual deficiencies that may occur for any number of reasons, including inflationary impacts, droughts, and emergency repairs. And then some of the challenges of having these higher level of reserves includes the funds in reserves. They can be used for more immediate needs, such as capital infrastructure or maintenance and repair. the government reserves are restricted to investments with extremely low risk, which means that they often don't keep up with inflation. I believe the current rate of return is about 2%, and then our long-term inflation is about 3%. And then it's particularly challenging in times like today, where inflation's sky high. And then also carrying reserves has a direct impact on rates to maintain that higher level of reserves. So for every dollar of revenue increases, about 25 cents goes aside for reserves. So we hired HDR to review our water and wastewater reserve policies and evaluate how they compare to industry standards and to our regional utilities. My favorite slide. This is going to be a little bit dry. I apologize in advance, but it is necessary and it is important. So the disaster reserves are meant to address financial impacts of natural disasters or events that significantly damage facilities and infrastructure. And these reserves are calculated based on 15% of the most recently adopted fiscal year operating budget. The contingency reserves are meant to minimize the adverse impacts of unexpected events on the organization or community. And the most common of these events is a recession. And these reserves are calculated based on 10% of the most recently adopted fiscal year operating budget. The capital reserves, we kind of touched on that a little bit in the last presentation, but the capital reserves are meant to fund major capital costs. And these are calculated based on either 5% of the value of capital assets or the average of the adopted capital program budget for the previous 3 years. And then we have the rate stabilization reserve. This was established as part of the wastewater and water debt issuances. And the minimum reserve amount is $1 million and $2.9 million for the wastewater and water funds respectively. But there's no target and there's no minimum reserve that's been established outside of what was in the bond documents. However, water did deposit some more funds into the rate stabilization reserve. And these reserves are special in that they can be considered as revenue. And they are considered for revenue for the debt coverage calculations, so long as the funds are transferred within a certain time frame. And then finally, we have our debt service reserve, and these are based on our debt, our SRF loans or our bonds, and the terms are outlined in those documents. So for example, for the SRF loans, we need to have 1 year of debt service obligation in reserves, and we have 10 years to build up that reserve. Okay, here is a snapshot of our existing reserves, and these are our reserves as of June 30th, 2021, so it's our fiscal year 21 reserves. And I use the 21 reserves as 22 are still being finalized. And you can see that the rate stabilization is $7.5 million for water as opposed to that minimum of 2.9. So HDR evaluated the city's reserves against several industry standards, including the American Water Works Association, or AWWA, the Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA, Fitch 2019 Medians, S&P, which is the one that we were rated, and Moody's. So per industry standard here, you can see that the operating reserve should be between about 30 and 90 days. And then the amount of unrestricted cash on hand varies significantly. The low end is 30 days and the high end is 570 days. So almost 2 years. Okay, and here we have the city's existing policies are reasonable when compared to industry metrics. So our contingency and disaster reserves combined, they kind of act as our operating reserve. And those combined are 25%, which is our 90-day of reserves for operating and maintenance. And it's important to note that the days of cash on hand, as outlined by the financial community, it generally reflects all unrestricted cash, which would, in our case, combine the contingency, disaster, and capital reserves. So when you add that capital reserve on top of our contingency and disaster reserves, we have about 212 days of operating and maintenance expenses in reserves. So that reflects the mid to higher rated utilities when compared to the financial community metrics. And so in this sense, the city has established minimum reserve policies that do reflect the standard approaches. Also of note is that you can still have a higher level of reserves, and that's okay as long as it's accompanied by a long-term financial plan that outlines the use of those funds in the future. And as we talked about in the last presentation, we do have a 10-year plan created when we do our water and wastewater rate studies. And then also of note, HDR also explored the idea of the city establishing a line of credit as a way to minimize risk. And they found that this could be a viable option, particularly for construction of large capital projects. The only downside, or one of the downsides, is that the city would need to pay a premium to the lender because they're basically hedging the risk of the city. Okay, so HDR found that the overall level of our reserves on a combined basis reflected general industry and financial best practices. They did have a few suggestions for revisions, and we did incorporate several of those in the proposed reserve policy changes. The first change was that the capital reserve should be based on the capital budget of the upcoming 3 years as opposed to the prior 3 years. And it should also exclude any debt-funded projects. And by excluding the debt-funded projects, that reserve would be based on more ongoing and routine capital improvements. The second recommendation that we incorporated is that we would add a capital replacement or a working capital reserve, and that is designated to address specific recurring replacement of critical infrastructure within a certain time period, and we chose 10 years. So that's kind of what we were talking about in our last presentation with the media and the filter replacements up at Cater and also eventually at DSAL. And finally, HDR recommended that the city should maintain the current rate stabilization reserves and that staff can deposit additional reserves exceeding the minimum, and that we would do that if we anticipated any negative impacts on our revenues, such as increasing probability of drought or mandatory water conservation. And as Joshua talked about earlier, we do have this unique rate structure where we are vulnerable to revenue loss. And so if we do have this mandatory rate conservation, so our rates, our tier 3 rates are about 3 times the tier 1 rates. So if we have mandatory conservation, that's going to most likely affect the tier 3 and the tier 2 users. So we are vulnerable to revenue loss. So HDR recommended that the ideal rate stabilization target is $3 million and $7.5 million for wastewater and water, respectively. And that's based on debt service requirements, ongoing drought conditions, and assuming no changes in annual rate levels. And so we already have that $7.5 million in our water reserves. It's going to be a challenge to get to $3 million for wastewater. And then the updated reserve policy that's going to be presented to council also includes direction to staff to consider establishing a line of credit.
And why, again, would the city have to pay like a surcharge on a line of credit? I don't understand that rationale. I mean, we are a good debtor, right? I mean,
Right, it was funny because I associated kind of like a HELOC, like a home equity line of credit. That's basically, but as you can imagine with a line of credit like this, there's a lot of legalese and due process that they go through that adds a pretty significant administrative cost to get it set up. And so that's why when we've been talking about this is if we go to do a line of credit, maybe we make it multi-purpose so that that cost can be spread against maybe a couple enterprises, not just water. So we're kind of exploring that right now, but I really like that because it doesn't have us sitting there with cash that's not earning, that's falling below market inflation, but it's available. If in emergency we needed to tap into cash, for example, FEMA wasn't quite ready to we could reach out, grab that, and keep water service going until maybe additional funding can come through. So, yeah, I think it's just another tool for us to be able to manage through a disaster or an emergency.
Okay, so that concludes the presentation.
Councilmember Snedden.
Was it time for questions? I'm sorry. Did I? Okay. So again, I appreciate that you're talking about this reserve policy differently from maybe how the rest of the city is looking at it. There's a lot of discussions at Finance Committee happening, and that's only 3 council members at a time, and I'm not sure everybody's in agreement on, just to put that out there, on what these recommendations to reserve policies might be. So this is particularly different, and you mentioned all these, drought, recession, wildfires, disaster, and then, in the presentation earlier, the impacts of the pandemic and just people's behavior and how that affects how vulnerable we are. So I just want to clarify, none of these recommended changes are recommending bringing the reserves down. Is that correct? Okay, I just wanted to really be sure of that. And then I'm not really clear on the line of credit. Is there going to be like more detail on that before it goes all the way forward? Okay.
Yeah, I think finance is going to dig into that. I know they're a little shorthanded, but that's something they want to dig into and kind of look at where a line of credit makes sense.
Are you looking for a separate action to direct that, or do you need direction to make that happen?
No, that's in the works. That's part of the proposal
Okay.
that we've already, it's baked into here to do that.
That's why I wanted to know.
So in terms of the, for the wastewater to go from 1 million to 3 million, what's the time frame, and what does that mean in terms of rate changes? Because, we're trying to stabilize the rate, but to do that, we have to so that's.
I really appreciate that question. This here establishes a minimum policy, which we're at the minimum, and the question will be, and I will be bringing that back to the Water Commission, talk about how exactly do that. Do we start to fund more money to reserves along with all the other needs we have and keep the rates under control? So that I think will be a good conversation. We will need to dig into it and see what that looks like. Offhand, a 1% increase in wastewater rates generates about $300,000. So to give you a sense, a 1% per year, yeah. So yeah, if you wanted to tackle it all in 1 year, that would be a pretty significant lift by our customers. So yeah, we got to figure out a strategy for doing that, and we'll be back to talk more about that.
Mr. Chair, going back to Councilmember Snedden's question, I'm a little confused. The resolution, is this a resolution that is the general resolution for a city's reserve policy? So we're actually amending the general resolution as, again, for purposes of water and wastewater?
So the general one went to the Finance Committee.
September 27th.
Yeah. And then we have this opportunity before it goes to full council to comment it on again. And so we are making these amendments, which we've talked to the finance director, and he's really supportive of the comments that are in here. And then those will get incorporated along with any Water Commission comments in the discussion at council.
Good, that clarifies it for me to make a motion, yeah.
Okay. Any other commission questions?
Well, I just wanted to emphasize what Commissioner Keller said about the wastewater rates and how that would impact. I think that's a really important consideration. And then I also just had a clarifying question on the the proposed change to add a working capital reserve. So would that be included in this 5% of capital assets or the average of the capital program budget, or would that be an additional piece?
It would be additional. Good catch. So just to clarify, Ms. Cook mentioned this, but for example, if we were planning in 3 years to replace the media at Cater, let's just use that as an example, what we might do, and we wanted to cash fund that, we might start putting money in this working capital reserves. It would be in addition to where the minimum policy is, and it would have a specific reason and a specific drawdown. So we'd have a plan to use that. But that'd be a way for us to kind of plan for that capital without it just, so that it was clear and transparent, because otherwise it just accumulates in your reserves and it looks like you're growing reserves. What's that for? You know, that could be used for something else. This would have a clear action, and it would be in addition to our capital reserves that are minimum required. So this, because we have something we're working towards.
And then similarly, that would affect water rates potentially?
Yeah, yes, that would have the plan, and that's why it would be nice to do it over multiple years, so you didn't have this giant increase that you needed to make. You could slowly accumulate those funds.
Got it, okay, thank you.
Okay, I think before the motion, I
Well,
need to
public
make
comment.
sure that.
Just make sure public comment.
Exactly, which I didn't do prior to this item. Any public comment on this?
No, not at this time.
Thank you very much. Okay, do I have a motion?
Yeah, I'd like to try a motion. The Water Commission recommended the city council adopt the amendments to the city's reserve policy resolution as proposed by staff.
A second? Second. Okay, Arturo, thank you. Madam Clerk?
Commissioner Davis?
Yes.
Commissioner Keller? Yes. Commissioner Kameyer?
Yes.
Vice Chair Cooney?
Yes.
And Chair Young?
Yes. Thank you. And Madam Clerk, just to be complete, did we have any public comment on the prior items?
We
that
did not.
We did not, okay. Thank you. All right, let's see. Moving right along, item 6C, water supply update. Mr. Hagmark.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I know how much you all look forward to November and getting to dig into our water supply update, and we won't disappoint. Ms. Corey has been working on pulling all the numbers together. I hope this will be a very informative conversation, kind of setting the stage for where we've been and where we're headed if it does not rain. Getting all of our ducks in a row so that we're ready to respond if indeed it remains dry. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Corey.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hagmark. Good morning, Water Commissioners, Chair Young, Councilmember Sennin. My name's Dakota Corey. Oh, I thought that was on, I'm sorry. My name's Dakota Corey, and I'm the Water Supply Analyst. And as Mr. Hagmark described, it's that time of year when we plan out for the next 3 future years with our water supply and make sure that we have enough supplies to meet needs. So that's what we're going to work through today. Quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to do a brief overview of water year 2022, but I'll be back next month in December with our annual water supply management report, and that's a backwards looking document, so we'll dive deep into those details next month. We'll look quickly at drought conditions both statewide and locally to kind of frame the environment within which we're doing our planning. We'll look at each of our individual water supplies and where they stand currently, and then we're going to put it all together into a strategy for the next 3 years. So first, a brief recap of water year 2022. This is a graph that compares how we plan to use our water in 2022, which is the bar on the left, and how we actually used our water in 2022, which is the bar on the right. You can see first that the bar on the right is shorter than the bar on the left, which means we used less water than we planned. And, it was about 1,200 acre-feet less, or 11%. And you can also see that we had planned to use much more Cachuma water, which is the royal blue color. And instead, we got a pretty decent supply from Gibraltar Reservoir, which is kind of the gray blue color at the top, and also more desal water than we had planned for. So overall, that allows us to store more of our water in Kachuma, which lets us stretch our supplies out into future water years. So good news there. This is a graph that you've seen many times before. It shows our total production, including recycled water, back to 1985, and that's the black solid line. What's interesting here, though, I think, is if you look on the right-hand side of the graph, you see the blue line, and those are our projected demands from our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. So the message here is that since 2018, which is the start of the planning for the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, we've been tracking with our demands very closely, which is nice because that's what we plan against when we're looking out for the next 3 years. So we can feel pretty confident that the assumptions that went into that demand projection are accurate and that we have a good baseline to plan against. This is another graph that you've seen before, but I think it's a good recap overall of where we stand. So I'm going to have this graph build on itself. It's pretty boring right at the moment. The black line at the top is our 2013 actual production. You'll recall that that's the baseline we've used for several years that we've kind of defined as pre-drought conditions. And then the gray line below it is our 2020 actual production, which is the state's new baseline. And then if we look at water year 21, so one water year previous, you can see that we're tracking much more closely to that 2020 baseline projection. A note here, you can see very clearly that in 2020 we actually had kind of a wet spring, and so that demand dropped really low in March and April. That makes 2020 kind of a rough baseline for us because in a normal year, we're comparing ourselves against very low demands in the spring. And then if we look at 2022 calendar year to date, you can see that we're staying right in that same range of those 2020 baselines. So overall, wrong way, our customers continue to conserve 25% against the pre-drought 2013 baseline. And as we talk through this presentation today, I'm going to try to keep inching us away from that baseline, but it really does, for those of us that have been doing this work for years now, help give some context. So our customers really have embraced conservation as a way of life, and the new baseline demands in the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan account for that. And we're really working right where we should be in terms of targets. So then let's look at drought conditions, both statewide and locally. We'll start locally with local rainfall totals. And I pulled these from the county's website, and I don't know why, but they use a different water year than we do. So their water year starts in September, ours starts in October, and they obviously end a month earlier as well. So looking September to August, rainfall at Gibraltar was 68% of normal, so a little bit better than last year. I think we were in the 54% last year, but still below average. And then rainfall at Kachuma was 65% of normal, and in town, 73% of normal. So a below average water year in terms of precipitation. And this is just a visual of rainfall at Gibraltar all the way back to 1970. Most interesting probably for this conversation is the lower right-hand corner of the drought. You can see the last time that we had some good above average precipitation was in 2011 when Kachuma last spilled, and then we've had a string of significantly dry years, really at about 50% of average, except for a couple of wet years, which have helped us stretch our supplies. And then you can see where we landed in 2022, still below average in that 68% range. So we're really just, this is like, you know, the environment that we're working within, just a string of dry years. And what does that look like at the state level? This is the U.S. Drought Monitor from the federal government. You've seen it many times before. It's a little improved since the ones I showed in the summer because we have seen a little bit of rain in the state. But if you look at Santa Barbara County, you can see most of the county is classified as an extreme drought. And if you look closely at the coastline where we sit, we're kind of on the border between extreme drought and exceptional drought. Again, I always like to iterate that this is based on physical conditions in the environment, so stream flow, soil moisture content, snowpack, not on anything to do with how much water supply is available. But the overall story here is that statewide conditions are very dry. We've had several years of low rainfall. And that is the environment with which we're doing our planning in. So now let's look at the city's individual water supplies and where they stand. First, we'll start with Gibraltar Reservoir, city operated reservoir located north or upstream of Kachuma. Currently, we have about 944 acre feet in Gibraltar. We're considering that functionally empty, however, because the water quality is very poor and it's very difficult to treat. So at this point, Gibraltar can fill up very quickly with just 1 or 2 storms. So we're hoping that we've got plenty of space in there for a couple of rainstorms that can flush some of that junky water out. Gibraltar was a great source for us this year. It provided about 14% of our total supply, just a little over 1,600 acre feet. And we did stop diversions in September again because of water quality. So really hoping for a couple good rainstorms to fill Gibraltar, spill it, and flush it out for next year.
The water quality is mostly organic matter or sediments?
Organic matter.
So it's green.
Yeah. So downstream of Gibraltar is Cachuma Reservoir. It's a shared resource. The city's one agency that has buckets of water located in Cachuma. Total storage in Cachuma Reservoir is just over 61,000 acre feet right now. It's at 32% capacity. Of that 61,000 acre feet, about a third of it is city water. So I don't know if any of you have driven up the 154 recently and saw the low levels at Cachuma, but it is sort of reassuring to know that a third of that water is the city's. It was a good source for us this year. It provided 39% of our total supply at just under 4,500 acre feet for the year. All of the water that we have stored in Cachuma currently is considered carryover water. We got a 0% allocation for water year 2023 from the Bureau on Cachuma. And I'm going to describe more in detail how that process works later on in the presentation. But basically, with the low lake levels and projections of use of Cachuma moving forward, the Bureau didn't think it was appropriate to allocate any water for us for water year 2023. State Water Project is another one of our available supplies. Our max table A amount, which means the maximum amount of water that we can get in a year from the State Water Project, is 3,300 acre feet. We got a 5% allocation for calendar year 22, so that means we got 165 acre feet. We are planning for a 0% allocation for 2023. If we think back to that map we saw of California, statewide drought conditions are pretty extreme. Reservoirs are low, and we don't anticipate DWR allocating water on the state project this year. We did use a little state water this year, 384 acre feet. And it's really to our advantage at this point in time to let our state water sit in San Luis Reservoir. And the reason for that is they don't apply evaporation. So as long as it's not in a threat of spilling, which it's not because San Luis Reservoir is pretty low, letting that water sit and using our Cachuma water instead, which does evaporate, is to our advantage. So we currently have about 1,200 acre feet stored in San Luis Reservoir. We don't plan on using any state water until the summer of 2024 currently, and we do still have 2,000 acre feet of water debt from some of the supplemental water purchases we made back in the height of the current last drought that we'll pay back when we have a greater allocation on the State Water Project. Desalination has remained a critical part of our water supply. In water year 2022, it provided a quarter of our total supplies at just over 2,800 acre feet. It continues to play an important drought preparation, response, and recovery role in that every drop of desalinated water we can produce means a drop saved in Cachuma for future years. So we're building up our surface water supplies in Lake Cachuma, as we saw when we saw that we had about a third of the water in the lake right now. This is a very colorful map of our groundwater basins. I'm going to talk about groundwater in a minute, but let me orient you on this map first. So there is a blue dotted line, I don't know, I can use the mouse a little bit, here that goes around, and that's our water supply service area. So you can see it includes Mission Canyon, where our city boundary is this gray line that doesn't include Mission Canyon. So the blue line is our service area. This thick turquoise line represents the Santa Barbara Basin, which is a groundwater basin that's divided into 2 storage units, which are outlined in these yellow and red hash marks. So we have the Santa Barbara Basin, which underlays most of the downtown area, and then storage unit 3. And then we also have the Foothill Basin, which is here outlined in red, which is in the Upper State Street area, and then our foothills. So those are our different groundwater basins that we have available to us. And looking at groundwater status, in the Foothill Basin, our concern is groundwater levels, how much water is stored in those basins and available for use. And in the Santa Barbara Basin, our storage unit 1, we're concerned about seawater intrusion and chloride levels. And so we're monitoring both of those things. Because we pumped the basins in like the 2014 to 2016 period, they're still low, and we do still see some intrusion, basically the ocean side of the freeway. We are seeing recovery in those basins, and I'm going to go into much more detail on groundwater in December, and I'll have graphs and charts and maps so we can look at all this more thoroughly. We did start pumping some groundwater this summer. In July 2022, we're pumping 2 wells from storage unit 1. It provided us 200 acre-feet of water for water year 2022. And we do have over 10,000 acre-feet of water available in storage unit 1 and about 3,800 acre-feet in Foothill Basin. So we do have water available as a supply as we're going into another potentially dry winter. And then just a note here, we've been updating you about the pilot ASR study for groundwater injection that we've been working on in the Foothill Basin. We did postpone that project because we want to start pumping the Foothill Basin this winter for water supply reasons, and we would mess up the study if we were pumping and injecting at the same time. So we've worked with the state, and we've put that on hold for now, and we'll reinitiate it when we don't need the supply.
May I ask a question back on the previous slide before we move on to recycle?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one slide back.
One more back.
So just that top border of the Foothill Basin that's so wavy gravy, what is going on there?
So if you can imagine, our foothills are kind of steep, and they have valleys and ravines. And this is the official boundary from USGS. But basically, the Foothill Basin has like our infiltration areas. So that's where you have like this alluvial fan that can infiltrate groundwater that comes down in the rain. And I think it follows sort of the ebbs and flows of that geography. And that's why it looks like that.
And then over to the right, that sort of upper extending tongue lollipop.
Yeah.
That's not a natural shape. Like, what is, do you know?
I don't
Maybe
know.
next time when we talk about the basins, I'm just really interested in that particular border, and what's above
Yeah.
it is all considered, I guess, recharge.
I'm trying to, is that Mission
area?
Creek area? Or, yeah, we'll look into it. It would be interesting if we overlay some creeks on here, and we might see that those are actually the valleys where the
Yeah.
creeks flow down the hillsides.
Yeah, maybe when it comes
Yeah.
back with the groundwater
Okay.
deeper look, that'd be just great to see
Okay.
some detail. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then before you move on,
Yes.
I've got a question, and I'm sure this has been asked many times before, but I'll ask it again. Do we have the ability with our geography to do any kind of stormwater capture and recharge? You know, when we get big storm events and there's a lot of runoff?
Yeah, so our groundwater basins, 1, are pretty small, so they're not a great place to store water. But 2, most of them are covered with a clay cap. And so we don't actually see, like, if we have wet water falling on the surface of the ground, it doesn't infiltrate to our groundwater basins. It's really in these specific infiltration areas like Mission Creek or up in the foothills that we get that recharge into the basin. And then in terms of stormwater capture, you're talking a large volume of water very quickly. So we'd have to have a place to store it and then infiltrate it. And that becomes pretty costly pretty quick.
Yeah, it's unfortunately just a challenge with our topography here. What makes this place beautiful makes it very difficult to get water in the ground. So just a little anecdote about like Mission Creek, for example. If water does not get into the ground by Oak Park, so upstream of Oak Park, it doesn't do us any good as water supply, because basically then it starts running into this clay lens, and it will stay at the shallow groundwater, which is not something we found usable in this area.
But can we puncture that clay lens in a few locations to facilitate recharge?
No, the only punctures we have are where our wells are, and we're very careful about that because we want to seal them off so that we don't get mixing between those lenses in particular, because the area that we pump from right now is actually artesianing, which is under pressure. When you don't even have to have the well on. When the basin is full, the water will just come to the surface through the well. And so that's helped us because it's kept pollutants from bad behavior from getting down into that precious groundwater basin
So where is the recharge naturally happening?
above Oak Park.
Above Oak Park.
Yeah, in
And
the foothills and the
Any
creek
way to
beds.
augment that? Above Oak Park?
Well, we're doing our pilot ASR injection study, so that is in the foothill basin. And potentially some of our other production wells could be injection wells. And so in wet years, if we had additional state water project water or Kachuma water, we could inject that into the groundwater. Again, that's still in a pilot phase, and so we need to look at how that water behaves once it gets put in the ground, and how it transports through the aquifer. And once we understand that better, we could get permitted by the state to inject more water.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you look at like Goleta or you look at Carpinteria, they really have this natural spreading grounds. It was probably alluvials that kind of put that down and spread that. Just never really happened here. And I think that's what makes this place look really pretty, but it also makes a challenge to slow the water down and get it into the ground. And I think it's just, that's just our, if you want to call it a curse, that's our challenge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to add probably a comment, maybe a question, but around more distributed stormwater capture at the residential scale on these, like there's lots of houses in this foothill basin and opportunities to do landscape scale, slowing and spreading.
Yes, and been having internal discussions about the stacked incentives, and we'll be back in January to talk specifically about what we're going to do to try and encourage that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, and our last supply not to be counted out is recycled water. Recycled water is an important part of our water supply portfolio because any drop of recycled water that's applied to the landscape replaces potable water that would instead be used to water landscape. So it plays an important role in our portfolio. In water year 2022, it represented about 9% of our total supplies, just over 980 acre feet. And we also used just under 300 acre feet for El Estero processed water. I did want to mention here that we only used 21 acre feet of potable blend water in the recycled water system during water year 2022. Those of you that have been with us a while will remember prior to upgrading the tertiary treatment at the recycled water plant, that could be upwards of like 500 acre feet per year. So this is a big improvement. Our recycled water system and plant is working very well in supplying the needs of our customers.
I had just an accounting question on that. So then is that 21 acre feet of potable water that's included in that 981 number, even though it's coming from presumably some other potable source?
Correct. So the 981 is what we supplied our recycled water customers for the year. Okay, so we've now got the environment that we're working in, which is presumably dry, and we know the status of each of our individual supplies. So let's put that all together and look out 3 years and make sure that we have enough water to meet our needs. And I'm going to apologize in advance. These next few slides are pretty text heavy. There's a real nuance to this planning that I'm trying to capture here, and I'm hoping this conversation is going to do it. Where we've talked about this a little bit at Water Commission before. We obviously want to be very conservative when we're looking out into the future with our water supply planning, because we could very easily, we know now, have another 3 dry years. However, when we kind of go supply by supply and make assumptions about how we're going to use them, I feel like what can happen is you can get like exponential conservatism or exponential like compounding conservatism. And so there's this nuance between wanting to be conservative because we have to protect the public's water supply, but not being so conservative that we start making decisions that maybe don't benefit the public in terms of like going out and purchasing expensive supplemental water because we're being ultra conservative. So there's a balance there, and I'm going to kind of walk you through that in these next few slides. with that sort of intro aside, I did use our baseline demand projections from the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, and as I showed earlier, our demands have been tracking really closely with that, so that's a really good target for us. And then starting to look at the supply side of this plan, I assumed 528 acre feet, it's 44 acre feet per month, of Mission Tunnel infiltration for each water year. And just to show you that this is already, we're starting to bake some conservative planning in here. Last water year, we got 718 acre feet from Mission Tunnel infiltration. And water year 16, which was our driest, most recent year, we got 574 acre feet. So reasonable, conservative, probably a good guess. So then let's look at Kachuma. Our maximum allocation per year on the Kachuma project is 8,275 acre feet. And as I mentioned earlier, we got a 0% allocation from the Bureau this year. So in the past, our water supply contract on Lake Kachuma gives pretty broad ability for the Bureau to come up with the allocation. There's not a lot of prescriptive rules on how they do that. And so in the past, they would just say how much unallocated water is in the lake. And unallocated water, so, there's always inflows into Lake Kachuma, and most of the water sitting in the lake has somebody's name on it. So it's either city water, or it's Goleta Water District water, or maybe it's minimum pool, or it's fish water, or it's downstream users water, but everything has a name tag. But some of these inflows don't get a name, and they sit in the lake, and that's what we consider unallocated water. And so for the next water year, that's the pool of water from which the Bureau can make an allocation and say, we're going to put your name on this water. And so in the past, they would just look at a point in time and say, okay, this is the volume of water that's unallocated, here's your allocation. They're getting a little bit more detailed in how they make that determination as the years have been dry. And so now what they're doing is they're looking at lake elevation, and they're also making projections of the use of drawdown on the lake. And they're looking out 2 years. And so they have a model that models lake elevation and drawdown. And we've worked as a Kachuma member unit with COMB to develop a lake elevation model as well, which is really excellent. And we compare models, and last year, that we compared models, and it was a really productive conversation, and it really helped us get we ended up with a 70% allocation last year. This year, they weren't as open to looking at our model. The member units requested a 15% allocation because that's what our model showed was appropriate. They gave us 0. And they told us to expect a 0% allocation next year, unless conditions really change. And so again, now we're thinking about this planning and looking out 3 years. How am I going to be conservative? Well, with Kachuma, I'm going to be pretty conservative, and I'm going to assume no allocation for the next 3 years. So that's where we land there. It gets a little bit more nuanced with Gibraltar.
So before you move on to Gibraltar, that kind of went very quickly and was a little confusing to me.
Okay.
I see 0 allocation, okay? So if I look at your very first bar graph that you presented,
Yeah.
I assume then that for the next year, we're going to see something that looks very different, right?
No, so I can clarify that for you.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You're right, that is confusing. And so we have 2 types of Kachuma water in the lake in any given year. We have current year allocation, and we have carryover water. So as I mentioned previously in the presentation, we have over 18,000 acre feet of carryover water. And so any Kachuma water that I show us using in the future is going to be that carryover water. But we have no allocation. We have no new water being added to that this year.
And we don't need the Bureau's permission to use that carryover water.
Right, that's already our water with our name on it.
That answers my question.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you. Okay.
Can I follow up on that question? And I meant to at least put it out there for a second. Is there any, discussion at the county level relative to dealing with carryover water?
Want me to answer it? I'm comfortable. Okay. So the staff is in constant communication with the county, and at a staff-to-staff level, they are supportive of our desire to keep carryover water in the lake.
Good.
The Bureau still is uncomfortable with the amount of carryover water the city has in the lake, and at the next time that we go to negotiate a new contract, that will be an issue in the negotiations. However, the Bureau is dragging their feet on that timeline, and we're looking at an extension of our current contract, and that extension won't have changes in it. So that's delaying that conversation of carryover water for a couple of years, probably.
In the extension, will they bring up the carryover question in the extension?
They always could, but the whole idea with the extension is the terms aren't supposed to change.
Right.
So they
That's what
shouldn't.
That's what I would assume. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
The allocated water is all in paper, but there's real physical evaporation. What happens in that case?
So that's also a really good question and a bit of a downside to our Kachuma supplies. So evaporation in the lake is a real physical process, and water is lost as a result. The way it's applied on paper is carryover water gets evaporated. And so even though there's all kinds of different water in the lake besides carryover water, all of the evaporation is applied to carryover. So we lose a pretty significant amount of water to evaporation each month because we have a large volume of carryover water in the lake.
Out of just pure curiosity, what's the issue with us having the amount of carryover water that we do in the reservoir? Why should the county care about that?
So
From their perspective?
yeah, we've asked that question and we haven't gotten a good answer. We've asked for them to show us studies or modeling that shows a downside to having more carryover water in the lake, and they haven't provided anything. From our perspective, water in the lake is good for everybody. It's good for recreation. It's good for, we're taking the majority of the evaporation. It's good for everybody. So we don't understand.
Okay. All right.
Good question.
Yeah. Okay, so Kachuma is always fun to figure out. Gibraltar is a little bit easier because at least we have city control over it. Our maximum average yield from Gibraltar is about 4,500 acre feet a year. That would be in a wet year when it's spilling and we can start diverting shortly after the sediment settles down. Last year, as I mentioned earlier, we got 68% of normal rainfall at Gibraltar, but we still got 1,600 acre feet of water just from that minimal rainfall. So what's great about Gibraltar is it can fill up with 1 or 2 storms, and it's a really valuable source for the city. So just because, again, I need to be conservative in my planning, I am assuming 0 acre feet of water available from Gibraltar in this current water year, so based on this current rainy season. However, looking out 2 years, this is where I feel like you can kind of compound the conservatism on the conservatism. And so instead of assuming 0% for the next 3 years, which is what we've done with our planning in the past, I assumed 1,000 acre feet would be available from Gibraltar in water years 24 and water years 25. And again, looking at the fact that we can get below average rainfall in a given year and still get 1,600 acre feet out of it, I don't think that that's being unrealistic, and it's still being conservative, but I'm not compounding conservative ideas on top of one another.
Mr. Chair, this is an off-the-wall question. Do we have any idea what the useful life of Gibraltar as a water resource is?
No, we don't. And the challenge is, at this point, the sediment has kind of reached the bottom of the gates. So now when we do get rain events, and the gates are about 20 feet tall, and now when we get rain events, it takes out sediment with it. Will it continue to go up? Yes. We've got some ideas on how we may still be able to exercise our water rights, even as the reservoir shrinks, but we still, there's still a significant water right there. We still have a pass-through agreement that should be at some point exercised.
That was my next question, obviously.
But in lieu of getting that, we've got some ideas on how we might continue to exercise. I'd be happy to talk with you about that. But yeah, it's still a huge asset, and as you can see in our planning.
Totally understand.
Yeah.
Thanks for the answer.
Okay, so moving on to the State Water Project. As I mentioned in previous slides, our Table A amount is 3,300 acre feet per year, so that's how much we can potentially get off of the project in any given year. DWR, who operates the project, has projected long-term reliability, and they've projected that at 58%. So over the long term, the average allocation should be 58% per year. However, we all know that we've seen really dry statewide conditions for several years now. So in 2022, and they go on calendar year versus water year, we saw the lowest allocation in history of 5%. Well, it tied with 2014 for the lowest allocation in history at 5%. So continuing to be conservative in my planning, I'm assuming a 0% allocation for water year 2023. That's a typo in my slide. And then in the past, when we did these projections out 3 years, we assumed 35% from the state water project. So again, trying to be conservative. But because the state is so dry and the project is so allocated right now, I didn't feel like 35% was appropriate. So I'm assuming a 15% allocation in water years 24 and 25 from the state water project. Desal, our maximum production capacity is 3,125 acre feet per year. Our average production over the last 5 years has been 84% of that. And then last year, we produced 92% of it, so we got pretty close. So again, being conservative but realistic, I'm assuming desal production at 80% of 3,125 acre feet for water years 23 through 25. And then groundwater is a little bit easier in that we don't have to guess based on rainfall what we're going to get in the next few years. It's really a guess or an educated guess based on what our production capacity is at our wells and how well they're going to operate. And so I've worked with our operators and we've come up with safe, conservative estimates on what we can get from our groundwater wells for the next few years. Again, we do have plenty of water in storage still. So we're saying 100 acre feet per month from storage unit 1, and we started producing in July of this summer from the Courtyard well and the high school well, which are both treated at Ortega Groundwater Treatment Plant. Next summer, we want to bring our Alameda well online, and that is going to be connected also to the Ortega Groundwater Treatment Plant. So that will bring production up from storage unit 1 to 145 acre feet per month. And then want to start pumping the Foothill Basin in January. And we would be getting 70 acre feet per month from the Foothill Basin, and that's the Hope and San Roque wells. And I'm sorry, there's a couple of errors in this slide in terms of timing. I tried to update it, but I must have not updated the right version. Okay, so, dun-dun-dun. Here's the big unveiling. You put all these text-heavy slides and all of these nuances together, and what do you get? So this is a graph you've seen before, and I know we have a love-hate relationship with it, all of us. It has actual production back to 2012. Each bar represents a water year, and each color in each bar represents the different water supplies that made up the supply portfolio that year. This graph does look out 3 water years. Water years 23 through 25 are projections. And so based on all of the assumptions that I provided in the previous slides, you can see here that we have enough supplies to meet needs through water year 2024, but in water year 2025, we start to see a shortage. So you'll see the top of that bar has like a red wavy line. That's our shortage. It's fairly significant. It's just under 4,000 acre feet in that year. So what do you do when you start to see a shortage in out years? You have to start planning for conservation. And so if we apply 15% mandatory conservation in the spring of 2023, so we're going to see what happens in the next few months in terms of rainfall. And if it remains dry, we would recommend to enact conservation at 15%. And then if conditions continue to be dry, we would up that to 20% for water years 24 and 25. Now, these percentages are against our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan baseline demands. So because we're still in this funny world of trying to figure out what that means currently, compared to 2013 baselines, that's about, the 15% is about a 30% conservation, and our customers are currently conserving 25%, so we'd be asking for an additional 5% from what they're already doing. And then similarly, the 20% mandatory conservation against our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan baseline demands is about 35 to 37% conservation compared to 2013. So it's an additional 10% to what our customers are doing now. We know they can achieve that because they've done it before. They've conserved up to 40% during the last drought. But things start to look pretty interesting. We're talking about lawn watering bans at that point. But that does allow us to stretch our Kachuma supplies into water year 26, which gives us the opportunity at one more winter. And so what does that look like graphically? In this graph, I've applied the conservation of 15% in water year 2023, and then 20% in 24 and 25. So you'll see the blue dots at the top of the bars, and that shows us meeting our demands through water year 2025. And so in summary,
Just a comment.
Yes.
Just a comment more than anything. I'm assuming has this come to council yet?
it's going in January 24th.
Okay, that paragraph, I had all these notes and questions as to the baseline and the 15%. You've just explained them all. And I just recommend when it goes to council, you put that into the report, because that's what a lot of the public reads, is the report itself.
Okay.
So you really explained it well as to how it relates to baselines on top of the current thing. That actually, I think, would just help in the presentation to the public.
Okay, excellent.
Good
Thank you.
job at doing that.
Okay.
I have some questions about these two graphs. Should I wait until I'll wait until you finish your last?
Either way, I have one more slide. So however you want to do it, I'm good.
I'll wait, and then I have some questions.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
So our summary of our water supply outlook through water year 2025 is that we don't anticipate any water shortages through water year 2024. So that's what we showed in the first graph. And then we anticipate needing 15% conservation in the spring of 23 if this winter is dry. And if conditions remain dry, we would need 20% conservation in water years 24 and 25 to stretch us into water year 26. So staff will be tracking winter precipitation. We'll also be tracking any action that's happening at the state level in terms of conservation requirements. And we anticipate either coming back to Water Commission and Council in early spring, like February, if things remain dry, or if we get a bunch of rain and we're not seeing the need for conservation, we'd probably come back in May per our regular time step. And that is the end of my presentation, so I'm happy to take questions.
And to clarify, when we say stretches us into water 26, that's 4 winters from now. That's this winter and 3 more. So substantial opportunities to have some improvement.
Or not. So back to our love-hate graph there.
The first one or the second one?
Well, I'm going to go back and forth between
Okay.
both of them. So this one first.
Okay.
Just a perception to have that huge bar called shortage is really alarming. And then you talk through how to make up for that. But this graph itself, something in the information that it conveys makes it look like we haven't planned and then we fall off a cliff and have this huge shortage, which I know is not the case. But having a graphic that can stand alone and look that way, I think maybe should have something else, some other words or something added to it, or color, shortage.
Could it be shortage without conservation or something like that as a better
Something.
label? Okay.
And then my other question is, how does it match up, like with the graph on page, this one?
Looks like it's a little different. With the
So it looks
Kachuma
different.
lines.
That gap isn't the same.
It's spread out for over 3 years.
Right.
You see the total, right,
Okay.
of those hash marks is the same
Yeah,
as the
so the bars
Right, so
heights are the same.
Yeah.
So water year 23 through 25, the height of the bar is the same in each graph, and so that's the amount of water we need to get.
So I understand that.
Okay.
But something about how this one doesn't match visually, and it has to be like verbally explained. Maybe,
Like if you had the last 3 years next to each other, the 2 bars with and without the conservation spread across the 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially what's happening is we're using less Kachuma water in 23 and 24 in this graph because we're conserving, and then that gets us to this graph. But that's hard flipping back and forth, so I can try to work on.
right,
Explain that.
so something in there.
Okay.
I'm not sure. And then that line, the blue line, the projected demands, maybe it'd be helpful to have that on.
In the first one?
In the first one.
Yeah.
So we can see where that gap is.
Okay.
And those are just, I'm not sure how to address it exactly, and I'm sure Water Commission has ideas, but something about that just looks like it's an unplanned for consequence that comes suddenly and is significant. And I know that's not the case. So that one. And then just a question back to way back to slide 4, I guess. Which you don't have to flip all the way back through there, but
Okay. I'm on way
it'd be
to.
great to have percentages on here. We can visually see that some supplies are more than others or less than others.
Trying to
Almost
see which
there.
one it is.
This
Okay.
one. But maybe just for the current or for the actual to date, maybe at that point or somewhere the percentages, because, I can see and I could calculate it, but, extra steps, but I'm really interested in what percentage difference that is in Kachuma usage. And then just on the website, we used to have that nice water droplet that had the breakout of our water supplies in percentages. And now with the new, very clean, modern website, it's tiles for each of the different supplies, but there isn't like one holistic picture of this is how much each of these supplies matter. They all look equally like they're contributing because they're equal tiles. So maybe this picture with percentages or that nice little water droplet that sort of visually shows more or less. But I refer to that figure often.
Okay.
And I went to go refer to it the other day and I was like, oh, it's gone. And then I wanted to be able to discuss the percentages, but I think it'd be nice for I'll say for myself selfishly, to have access to that.
The droplet is better than the tile, yeah.
Yeah, I like, or somewhere in there, something that ties the holistic picture together, because the tiles go into so much detail individually, but there isn't the one picture all together. But that's all. Thank you.
Well, that graph doesn't disappoint. Always gets a good conversation going. And we do have, we are going to be working on the water supply management report, which is a backwards document. But what we'll do is we'll bring back after hearing what you have to say, bring back some options, because we would like to get this dialed for the presentation to City Council in January.
And I have another comment about that graph on slide 26. Not necessarily about the visualization, although, yeah, I think I agree with Councilmember Seddon's comments. It's a little confusing looking at that shortage and then also looking at like the bars are a little bit different on slide 28, and it's not totally intuitive why, although I think I understand now after your presentation. But the other thing I just wanted to mention is that looking at water year 2022, so this was 11% lower than expected, and yet we still anticipate demands increasing in future years. And so I'm just wondering about those assumptions, because then it looks like, we anticipate demands are increasing and therefore our shortage is going to be bigger. But I guess maybe understanding why we anticipate those demands to increase would help us round out this picture.
Sure, that's a really good question. So again, my basis for the demands are our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan baseline demands. And when we developed those demands, we were assuming rebound from the previous drought, which I don't even know how to describe it anymore, the early stages of the current drought, or
2014, 2015.
yes. And so we do anticipate that our demands will continue to increase at a fairly a stable rate, and our projection was that was going to take 8 years for that rebound to occur. And so that's why we're seeing that increase here. Of course, that's offset by our conservation program. So there's, polls either direction on demand, but we did see an overall increase out in the next few years. And so far, if we were to go all the way back to the beginning of the presentation where it shows our production versus demands, we are seeing that slow increase since 2018. So the baseline demands from the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan seem to be pretty accurate.
And of course, we could go in and make alterations to this. It would make it less conservative. But I think for the time being, we're tracking as following the enhanced urban water management plan right now with our usage. And until we have a good justification to deviate, which we may next time we sit down and check, and if the community is doing something different, I think you could have some confidence that we are anticipating demands going up, and if we can make a difference in that, that would definitely improve our water supply situation. We may need to ask for less conservation. We may get the conservation and may be able to stretch our surface supplies or groundwater supplies further. But I would say it's probably at this point, it's probably on the higher side of what we might expect from the community's water usage. I also know that it doesn't include, let me make sure I get this right, doesn't include a full year of the water supply agreement with Montecito.
So this graph does.
Does, okay.
Yeah.
So that's part of it too. I guess I think this is a more general comment, not so much about this graph, but as we're thinking about like how we talk about drought and conservation versus adapting to a more arid climate. And I feel like sometimes, the constantly asking for conservation has like a different tenor and approach than like, okay, as a community, we're, adapting to a new reality of just more aridity and less water supply reliability. And so that's kind of neither here nor there on this graph, but just something to be thinking about.
No, I appreciate it. The past language that we used, we called it extraordinary conservation. So conservation is a way of life, but there are times we're in a certain situation which we're going to be asking for extraordinary conservation. I don't know if that is along the lines of what you're thinking, so that we might be able to better articulate that this is something different from what we're expecting you to be doing on a normal basis.
Yeah, and I know conservation as a California way of life comes from the state, and that's just what we're stuck with, so.
Any other commission questions?
Yeah, just
or
a,
comments? Go
maybe a
ahead.
suggestion, going back to the question on the dueling graphs and explanation. Maybe you could put them both up at the same time and talk to them, right? If you had them basically there and say, this is essentially where we're going without extraordinary conservation during this potential drought that we've got going. Here's our adaptive plan to get there. And then your slide on mandatory conservation, follow that, which codifies what you just said, but essentially walk through how that works, rather than, I know what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Logically, you're trying to say, we got a potential drought, what are we gonna do? We're gonna do this now that we solve the problem. Maybe do it on just a suggestion, you might do it on a single slide and discuss it and lead through that. Anyway, just a thought.
I like that. I think that was my intention in today's
Yeah.
presentation, and maybe just that visual of having them side by side would be a better way to convey that.
Yeah.
Or how about this? Just put in parentheses after the word shortage, to be met via conservation, or plan to be met via conservation.
Yeah, the thing is, the second slide shows you how you do it ahead of time.
Right.
Not just that year.
Right.
Not just cutting back if you get there. I mean, that is a strategy. You could say, oh, we're just gonna gamble and see where it goes, but I like the approach of basically saying, we're being proactive. We're recognizing that we're in an extraordinary situation. And just a suggestion that, I think you explain it really well, but I think the graphs, and for the public, they will get lost. Or react, inappropriately.
I think one solution that's very close to what Dave is saying is to get rid of some of the older years. I mean, it's great to have that history, but we don't really need to see it anymore. And then to have the projections without conservation and with conservation right there, so you would see them next to each other, and then you can see the comparison. If we don't do anything, we're going to have the shortage. If we do this, we're going to see that. That'll
And
make it a lot
It's
cleaner.
also, if we don't do anything and we get 4 dry winters.
Correct.
Like, I
Yeah,
think
that's a
that
good
is an
point.
important clarification on this shortage. Like, shortage in the case of 4 more dry winters in a row, because I think that makes it, you understand why it's so big when you see that. It's like, okay, if it doesn't rain for another 5 years. And so maybe that, it could help. It's like shortage if there's no rain and we don't conserve, which is, both of those things are unlikely, hopefully. Well, I don't know about the rain, but the conservation at least.
You know, we've really struggled with this graph. Arturo's,
Going through the chair.
yeah, I'm sorry.
Please.
It's a free-for-all.
We're having a commission discussion.
Go ahead.
Okay, going to Arturo's point. I'm sorry, Kristen.
Oh, it's okay.
To Arturo's point of getting rid of the early years, the thing of the early years, though, it shows what happened in the major drought and how low we actually got. And so that point, going forward, again, to Cora's point, if in fact we have another, 2 years, we're gonna go back down. We're gonna go back down to where we were.
Yeah,
So-
reinforcing that, I like that in this graph because you see just below the blue conservation, the height of the bar, and you can see that we were much lower in previous years. And so the history is kind of valuable there to show that we did it once before.
Yeah, because really what we're talking about is demand control. And in fact, the blue bars aren't really anything. It was actually the bars back down with the first orange.
Right.
With the state water purchase. And we're just showing how we're getting there, right? So over time, you lose those other bars. So again, I think you got a lot of input.
I love it. I'm a nerd. I'm a water nerd. This is what makes me excited, right? So
It is 10
Thank you for
after
your input.
12. We have one more item. Not to
Councilmember Sneddon.
contain things, but Councilmember Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, I think you only need this chart, actually. I don't think you need to show that if you don't do it, then you fall off a cliff at the third year. I think you show just right here. And it keeps those previous years in there, which I think are important to show how much water we used to use. And then, this is the plan. So why not just stick with the plan instead of what the iteration? And then I think I won't go burn in time, but, it does raise the question again about population, what is, the amount of population the city can sustain. And I won't ask you to comment on it because I know it's a really tricky issue, but, in the past, at this commission, the answer has always been, well, we use less water than we used in the 50s, and we have double the population, and we could meet the demands of what we have and all the conservation. But now we're looking at increasing that conservation even more, and it becomes a different conversation, I think. I'm just going to put that there now, and whether the wastewater systems can handle, say, an 8,000 to 10,000 more units, for instance. So I think it's a good question of why we expect that demand to go up over time. So I'm just leaving that there, but just for comment.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Any public comment on this item?
Not at this time.
Okay, so that was just a presentation, correct? No vote needed. Thank you very much for that, Dakota. And Mr. Hagmark, the last item, the Water Resources Manager's Report, item 7.
Yes, you have this packet in your report to look through here. I just wanted to draw your attention. Wanted to talk specifically about a new graph. We heard you all loud and clear at the last meeting wanting to put in some of the upcoming legislation and where it's taking us. And I don't know, Dakota, if you wouldn't mind walking us through that.
Sure. So this is a graph that you have seen before with some edits. And so in the past, our state regulated target was 20% by 2020, which is represented by the red bar that goes down the top from 130 gallons per capita per day on the left-hand side. And so we tracked our overall city GPCD against that target, which was the blue line. And you can see that we blew that target out of the water. We were significantly below it. And then the state is still developing targets for beyond 2020, but they're coming pretty close to defining what those are. And so we've put in the gray hashed line on the right-hand side of the graph, and then the kind of purplish hashed line below that. and also the orange line. And so the targets that the state is proposing moving forward in the future graduate over time, so they get more strict over time. And they're also tracking just residential gallons per capita per day water use versus overall gallons per capita per day. And so the orange target is our it's our provisional target because it hasn't been fully adopted by the state yet for 2020 through 2025. And then the gray hashed line is our provisional target for 2025 through 2030. And then the purple hash line is 2030 and beyond. And again, this is just tracking residential gallons per capita per day. And so that's what you see in green on this graph. And so you can see that we're actually significantly below all of our targets, even out to 2030 currently. One thing that I want to add is that the state's targets are comprehensive. So residential gallons per capita day is one piece of what they're going to be asking us to work on. We're also going to have a target for water loss, for outdoor water use, and for commercial. And so in terms of the what's portrayed in this graph, these are the appropriate targets to convey, but we'll have other targets we're working on meeting as well.
Is the whole graph for residential use?
No.
I don't think so.
It includes
but
like
I
the
get
whole
you.
community, and then there's just the residential.
So the blue
my
and the
question,
red
the
were
difference
whole
between the blue
community.
and the green is the industrial and commercial, right?
Yes,
Blue is everything,
Right.
blue's
So
everything,
the
and
difference
green
between
is
those
just
two
residential.
yep, yep.
Yeah,
just green.
yes.
We could reshape this just to be just residential on here, but that's the one outlier is prior regulations were focused on GPCD for the whole community, and that did kind of hurt us to some extent because we get a lot of tourism here, and so we still did well, but they're really kind of honing in on this residential because every community, in particular their indoor usage, should be fairly standard community to community.
I guess one other piece of information here is that currently the state is using 2018 usage as the baseline for these targets. And they did an aerial flyover to classify landscape as either irrigated or non-irrigated, and that's when the flyover was. So that will probably stand as our baseline for these targets. So this is, those targets are based on our 2018 usage. And that will probably stand.
Always need a new baseline. That was the extent of my going through this graph. Obviously, I'm happy to speak to any questions Commission might have in here. If there isn't any questions, I just wanted to talk about a few things we have going on. The December meeting, it's looking like it may need up to 3 hours. We've got the Aquaterra water storage. We want to just introduce that topic. We have the Water Supplies Managers Report, which we've had a pretty lengthy conversation today, so maybe we move through pretty quickly through that, and then the water supply, water system annual report. So depending on the level of questions, we could keep it to 2 hours, but I think I might notice it as a 3, just in case.
Just to flag, I'm going to have to miss that meeting. I'm going to be at the Colorado River Water Users Association conference. But I'm very disappointed about that because I want to get that update from Dakota. So I'll have to look at the files and get back to you all on that.
Okay. Thanks. Anybody else not going to be able to make that meeting? Just wanted to, that's on the 15th. Okay, great. Secured pipeline at Kachuma. I had the opportunity to be up at Kachuma yesterday. You could go up there and you too could get a river cruise. And I highly recommend it. It's, I'm sure all of you have had an opportunity to do that, but yes, the former river is showing up and there are lots of, it was great. There was 3 bald eagles yesterday, ospreys, deer. It was going off. It was really amazing. But I was there because we were checking out the secured pipeline construction that is progressing very nicely. They're starting to push the pipeline. They're basically attaching these cement collars to the pipe and floating it out, and they'll get it all on there. Then they take it out there, connect it to the intake, and then basically sink it. So it's kind of exciting to see that going forward. So if you have any reason to go or looking for something to do this weekend, and they do great naturalist tours up there. Anyway, it was great. And then depending on how you look at this, is good news or bad news. Ms. Taylor has submitted her resignation. She's retiring.
What?
Yes, and her last day in the office is this December 16th. So I will be sending you information on a little get-together to celebrate. No speeches, no speeches. She's made it very clear, no speeches, but she would love to see if you have time to attend, and that'll be sometime after work. We're looking at December 14th from 4:30 to 6:30 right now, so. The 14th, yeah, and I will send you details so you know the location and all that good stuff.
Doesn't she need permission from the commission before she makes a move like this?
I know, it seems at some point, at nearly 3 decades, there should be some type of approval process.
Right.
So anyway, with that was my,
Yeah, okay. Any public comment on this item? Any commission questions or comments on this item? Okay, then we are adjourned. Thank you very much.